My hands buried many, but here the ground refuses them, and at night I still hear the chains dragging.
I've always believed that when someone dies, the earth receives them in silence, as if it were an ancient pact between man and the soil that sustains him in life. But in that coastal town, where I worked for years, that pact seemed to have been brutally broken. I still remember the first time I was asked to prepare the burial of a fisherman who had drowned at sea. He was a man known to everyone, someone who had braved storms, survived gales, but who, in the end, met his death in the very place he loved most, the ocean. As we lowered the coffin onto the edge of the coastal field, something strange happened. The sky, which had been clear until then, suddenly darkened. The wind blew hard, bringing with it the heavy smell of salt and sea air, and the waves began to rise like walls of water, trying to reach the cemetery. I saw freshly laid flowers being swept away like useless toys, and the wooden cross that would mark the grave was broken in two, as if crushed by invisible hands. Some would say it was just coincidence, that nature sometimes acts unpredictably, but I swear to you that in that instant I felt as if the sea were alive, and that it would not allow that body to rest anywhere other than in its depths. You might think my mind was tired, that it was all just an illusion created by fear, but that night as I retired after work, I clearly heard something that could not have been a figment of my imagination. A low voice, carried by the wind, seemed to be calling me from outside. Let me return to the sea. And it was there that I understood that this story was just beginning. Before continuing this story, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that many prefer to remain silent about. The next morning, while the village was still talking about the sudden fury of the waves, I was called to inspect the fisherman's grave. The cold wind bit my face, and each step toward the coastal field felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself wanted to warn me of what I would find. The coffin was still there, buried beneath the damp earth, but the atmosphere felt different, heavy, as if an invisible shadow had settled over the place. The man we had buried was no stranger. His name was Thomas Harlow, a veteran fisherman, the son of a family that had lived for generations on the Maine coast. Everyone said he had the sea in his blood, that he was too stubborn to heed the signs of danger. And when he disappeared on the high seas in his suit, many believed he had been swallowed up by his own arrogance. However, what intrigued everyone most was the way his body had been found, tangled in fishing nets, miles offshore, but with no signs of decomposition, as if he had emerged intact from the depths. As I gazed at that grave, I couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas didn't want to be there. It was as if the sea itself was reclaiming its former possession. Some residents, superstitious by nature, began to whisper that he had made a pact with the ocean and that his soul would never rest on dry land. I tried to dismiss these thoughts, but the more I thought, the more convinced I became that something was wrong with this burial. And it was during the second night, when the village had already retreated into silence, that things began to spiral out of control. I was alone, walking among the graves, when I first heard a drawn-out whisper coming from the direction of Thomas's grave. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my mind. It was a voice calling. That night, the cemetery seemed quieter than ever, but it was a strange, heavy, almost suffocating silence. I walked among the tombstones with my flashlight in hand, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something was watching me from afar. It was then that the wind began to blow from the sea, bringing with it not only the intense smell of salt, but also something that seemed denser, more alive. I stopped walking for a moment, closed my eyes, and heard it clearly. A hoarse, drawn-out voice begging in a mournful tone, "Let me go back to the sea." The sound seemed to come from all around, as if the breeze itself carried the desperate plea. My heart raced, and even though I tried to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination, I knew deep down that it wasn't. It wasn't the first time I'd spent nights alone there, and I'd never heard anything like it. It was as if death had found a way to communicate through the wind. In the following days, the whispers returned, always at night, always louder, and always repeating the same words, as if they were part of an endless ritual. I began to lose sleep, feeling the presence of something that accompanied me even when I was away from the cemetery. The sound of the waves crashing on the shore no longer sounded natural to me, but rather like distant moans, voices that mingled with the foam and roar of the sea. On the third night, when I was almost convinced I was going mad, something happened that I can't forget. I was walking among the graves, trying to ignore the wailing, when I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. I immediately turned around, shining my flashlight on it, but there was no one there. Just the tombstones, the low-lying fog, and the insistent sound of the sea. And it was in that instant that I realized the whispers weren't just distant voices. They were getting closer and closer, and more determined. The morning after that night, I felt that icy hand on my shoulder. I was overcome by a strange uneasiness. I decided to return to the cemetery early, even before sunrise, because something inside me told me I would find signs of what had been haunting me. The air was heavy, and the fog crept in like a thick blanket, making each step even more tense. When I reached Thomas Harlow's grave, my heart nearly stopped. The tomb was open. There were no signs of human rape. The earth appeared to have been pushed from within, scattered in disordered mounds. The coffin, to my astonishment, was intact, but placed on the ground, as if someone had carefully removed it from the grave during the night. And there were no human footprints around it, only damp marks, similar to barefoot footprints, leading toward the shore and disappearing into the sea-soaked rocks. The shock wasn't just mine. Locals who arrived soon after confirmed what I'd seen, and I swear I'll never forget the look of horror on their faces. Some claim to have seen, in the distance, a staggering, drenched figure walking slowly toward the waves, as if guided by an irresistible force. It was impossible to know if it was real or just a product of collective fear, but the truth is that from that day on, no one dared approach Thomas's grave without feeling the suffocating weight of that presence. The news spread quickly, and the entire village began to avoid the coastal field. They said it wasn't just a body that lay there, but a dissatisfied, rebellious soul, determined to return to the sea that had consumed it. I tried to convince myself that everything could be explained rationally, but every time I looked to the horizon and saw the waves crashing furiously, I had the feeling that the ocean was, indeed, demanding its due. And it was this growing fear that led the community to make a desperate decision. Fear gripped the village. No one could sleep peacefully knowing that Thomas Harlow's body was no longer in his grave. Voices spread from house to house, and each resident told a different version of what they had seen or heard. Some said the fisherman would appear on the beach in the early hours of the morning, drenched, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Others claimed his name echoed in the wind like a lament trapped between the waves. The community, pressed by collective terror, decided it was time to do something. That night, we gathered by the sea. The coffin was once again removed from the cemetery and carried to the shore. I walked with other gravediggers, but none of us dared to look directly at the dark wood that held the body. Each step felt heavier, as if we were carrying not just a corpse, but the very curse that accompanied it. The elders, men of faith and superstition, said the only way to calm the sea would be to return Thomas to his true home. We formed a circle around the coffin, and everyone began to pray. The words mingled with the sound of the waves, creating a hypnotic murmur that seemed to connect directly with the fury of the waters. The wind roared, the torches flickered, and suddenly, silence. An absolute, almost deafening silence. The sea, which had been choppy until then, became as calm as a mirror. It was at that moment that we pushed the coffin toward the tide. The water received it without resistance, slowly covering it until it disappeared into the darkness. For a brief moment, we felt relief, as if we had finally ended a cycle that should never have been interrupted. But that same night, as I closed my eyes, I was haunted by a dream. I saw Thomas emerging from the depths, his eyes vacant and his mouth half open, repeating the same words that had already haunted me. "Let me go back to the sea." And that's when I realized the nightmare was far from over. Since that night we returned Thomas Harlow's body to the ocean. No further attempts have been made to bury fishermen in the coastal countryside. The community, scarred by fear and memory, decided that certain dead do not belong on dry land, and so a tradition was born. All who were claimed by the sea would return to it. It was as if that ancient pact between life and death had been rewritten by the ocean itself. I continued my work as a gravedigger, but I never looked at that piece of land the same way again. The wooden crosses that had stood firm are still covered in saltpeter today, tilted by the incessant wind, and the flowers that some unsuspecting visitor dares to leave inevitably disappear, swept away by the tides that seem to extend beyond the beach. The coastal countryside has become an avoided place, a territory of silence where even the birds seem to refuse to land. Sometimes, when I walk alone near the cliffs, I still hear the same voice that haunted me so many nights. I don't know if it's my weary mind insisting on reopening old wounds, or if Thomas's spirit continues to wander, unable to accept his eternal prison. But I confess something to you. Whenever I hear the roar of the sea on stormy nights, I feel I'm not alone. It's as if each wave carries a whisper, a memory, a warning that the sea does not forget, much less forgive. And perhaps that's why I say without hesitation, if you ever visit that coast, don't get too close to the water at dusk. Because the sea, my friend, the sea always finds a way to call back what belongs to it. There are secrets that small towns prefer to keep silent, stories that circulate in whispers, passed down from generation to generation, but never recorded on paper. I grew up hearing that the hill that rises above the village should be avoided after sunset, and that the cemetery built there bore a mark no one dared challenge. I confess that at first I thought these were just local superstitions, stories created to scare children. However, when I began working as a gravedigger in that region, I discovered there was something much deeper and more disturbing hidden within that land. What impressed me most was the older people's insistence on repeating the same phrase. The hill does not accept rest. I didn't fully understand what they meant by that until the day I witnessed the first attempt to bury a young woman named Emily Carter, who had died tragically. The coffin was carefully prepared, the grave dug with precision, and everyone believed that after the burial, silence would return to the hill. But the unexpected happened. As we threw the final layer of dirt over the coffin lid, the ground shook slightly as if something beneath had shifted. The wood creaked, and within moments, cracks began to open around the newly sealed grave. The murmurs of those present turned to muffled screams, and no one dared linger near for long. It was as if the earth itself had rejected the body. That night, I still tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence. Perhaps the weight was unevenly distributed, perhaps the ground was unstable. But deep down, Something told me this was just the beginning of a story that would go far beyond a simple fault in the ground. And I was right, because the next day the grave revealed a secret that I have never been able to erase from my memory. Before continuing this story, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that many prefer to remain silent about. Her name was Emily Carter, and even years later I can still hear the villagers talking about her in hushed tones, as if even the memory were dangerous. Emily wasn't a stranger. Everyone knew who she was. Young, full of life, but also surrounded by stories that shrouded her in a veil of mystery. Some said she possessed a restless spirit, unable to conform to the rules of a small town. Others claimed there was something about her that seemed to attract tragedy. The fact is, her death was as sudden as it was inexplicable. She was found at the foot of the hill on a misty morning. Her body was intact, with no clear signs of violence, but the position in which she was found raised doubts. Some believed she had fallen accidentally, others suspected suicide, and a few swore someone had pushed her. What no one could explain was why she was barefoot, her feet covered in damp earth, as if she had walked alone at night toward that forbidden place. The funeral was rushed. The family, visibly shaken, silently accepted the official explanation: an accident. However, the looks on the faces of the residents betrayed something different. No one fully believed that version, and the weight of what was unsaid loomed large. For me, the moment the coffin was closed remains etched as a disturbing scene. It was as if the air had grown denser, colder, as the wooden lid was sealed. During the burial, I tried to focus on my work, but the feeling of estrangement wouldn't leave me. The ground seemed to refuse to receive the body, as if something within it was in conflict. And when the earth began to crack shortly after the burial, I knew this wasn't just a tragic death. It was the harbinger of something that would haunt not only the hill, but all who dared approach it. And this certainty was confirmed the very next morning when I found the grave in a state that defied any logical explanation. I returned to the cemetery early at dawn, driven by a restlessness that had kept me awake. The wind blew hard at the top of the hill, and the fog made the path even slower and heavier. When I finally reached Emily Carter's grave, my heart raced. The grave was open. It didn't appear to have been disturbed by tools or human hands. The earth was scattered unevenly, as if it had been pushed from the inside out. The coffin was partially exposed, tilted, and what chilled me most were the marks around it. They were footprints, bare, clear footprints, sunk into the damp earth. They circled the grave as if someone had walked in. Circles, indecisive, before heading toward the edge of the hill where the marks simply disappeared. I knelt down to observe closely, but the more I looked, the more I felt there was no explanation for it. There had been no rain the night before. No one could have climbed this far without leaving other tracks. And even if there had been, who would walk barefoot on that cold, rough earth? I told the other gravediggers what I saw, but they wouldn't listen. One of them, older and superstitious, simply told me we shouldn't disturb something that clearly didn't want to be disturbed. I swear I saw genuine fear in his eyes, as if it wasn't surprising to him that the hill had rejected another body. That night, as I tried to sleep, I closed my eyes and relived the scene. And the more I thought about those footprints, the more I felt as if Emily was trying to point something out. He wasn't just a trapped spirit. He was someone who refused to rest on that ground. And I only understood the real weight of this refusal when, shortly afterwards, reports of the first apparitions began. The following days were marked by an eerie silence in the town. People had previously avoided climbing the hill, but now even mentioning Emily Carter's name seemed to carry a weight no one wanted to carry. The first stories began to circulate in whispers. Residents swore they'd seen a female figure walking slowly along the hilltop in the early morning hours, her white dress soaked with dirt and her disheveled hair falling over her face. Some said she was crying. Others claimed they heard low chanting, almost like a broken melody, carried by the wind that descended toward the village. The gravediggers, who had previously maintained silence, began refusing to work at night. One of them confided in me that he felt cold hands gripping his shovel as he tried to close the grave for the third time. Another swore he saw the coffin move on its own, as if someone inside had pushed the lid in. Desperation. None of them wanted to stay after sunset, and with each passing night more stories added to the collective fear. The hill began to be avoided even during the day. Children were forbidden from playing nearby, and even the animals seemed to sense something, as dogs barked toward the cemetery for no apparent reason, growling into the void. And then, on the fourth night after the funeral, the phenomenon repeated itself. The grave once again was open, the earth scattered, the wood marked as if nails had scratched inside. The morning silence was broken by the scream of a woman who found the footprints again, fresh, around the grave. It was at that moment that everyone understood that this was no longer an accident of the soil or the fragility of the wood. Emily would not accept this rest. It was as if the young woman's spirit rejected any attempt to be contained. And it was in the face of this growing fear that the desperate community sought a more radical solution, a ritual that, they said, could finally silence the hill. Fear had already spread throughout the town, and no one dared approach the hill alone. It was then that the elders, guardians of local traditions, decided they needed to try something different. They called the pastor of the small church in the center of the village, a man known for his unwavering faith, but who hesitated when he heard the full story. Even so, he agreed to conduct what they called a containment ritual. That night, a group of locals, along with some gravediggers, climbed the hill carrying torches, salt crucifixes, and holy water. The air was thick, and each step seemed accompanied by a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of wind blowing through the trees. The coffin had been lowered into the grave earlier, but everyone knew it wouldn't remain there for long if nothing was done. The pastor asked us to form a circle around the grave. The prayers began quietly, but soon gained momentum, mingling with the crackling of torches and the rustling of leaves. They scattered salt around the grave, planted crosses in the ground, and poured holy water over the coffin lid. I remember the feeling of the air growing colder with each word spoken, as if something invisible resisted those attempts at expulsion. For a few moments, it seemed as if everything had worked. The wind died down, and the night became eerily calm. The residents breathed a sigh of relief, believing that Emily would finally find rest. Some even said they felt a presence dissipate, like a weight lifted from their shoulders. But when the sun rose, the illusion was shattered. The grave was cracked again, the crosses had fallen to the ground, and the coffin lay exposed as if it had been pushed forcefully from within. The morning silence was more frightening than any scream, for everyone understood that nothing could contain what dwelt on that hill. And since then, the story has turned into something even darker. From that day on, the hill was marked by an almost sacred silence, not in the sense of peace, but rather of fear. No one dared to bury their dead in that cemetery anymore, and families sought other locations, even if it meant traveling miles to ensure their loved ones would not rest in that cursed ground. Emily Carter's grave remained like an open wound, always cracked, always exposed, as if a constant reminder that some souls do not accept the rest imposed by the living. Even after so many years working as a gravedigger, I've never been able to erase from my memory the sight of those bare footprints surrounding the grave. It's as if with each memory, I can still feel her presence walking slowly behind me, watching me silently. waiting for something I'll never understand. Time has passed, but the hill remains there, isolated, with fallen crosses, disturbed earth, and a wind that seems to carry laments with every breath. Those who pass by swear they hear muffled cries, as if the young woman still wandered between the world of the living and the dead, refusing to accept whatever fate has been imposed upon her. I confess that to this day I avoid looking directly at the top of the hill when I walk through the village, for fear of seeing a female silhouette standing among the tombstones, motionless, staring at me with eyes that no longer belong to this world. And if you think this is the most disturbing story I've heard in my work, I must say you're mistaken. The truth is that every cemetery holds secrets, and some of them are even darker than Emily Carter's grave. Because not far from there is another story, one in which the entire sea seemed to reject a dead man who refused to rest on dry land. There are stories that span generations and refuse to disappear, tales that settle in the hearts of small towns and become silent warnings to those who dare to challenge the inexplicable. This is exactly what I encountered when I began working near an old church in the American countryside, a building built in the 19th century where time seemed to have stood still, but where the earth held secrets that no priest or faithful dared speak aloud. From the beginning, I heard rumors of a tomb that never remained closed, as if the ground itself rebelled against those who sought to rest there. The case began with the burial of a man who, in life, had been a priest, but not just any priest. He was accused of heresy, someone whose reputation had been tarnished by practices considered forbidden, even within the church itself. His funeral was tumultuous, marked by suspicious looks and murmurs of disapproval, but they still decided to bury him in sacred ground, believing that his death would put an end to any controversy. However, during the first attempt to cover the coffin with dirt from the cemetery, something strange happened. The next morning, when the gravediggers returned, they found the coffin outside the grave, intact, resting on the earth as if placed there by invisible hands. There were no signs of tampering, no footprints, only clear evidence that the tomb refused to accept its guest. Some tried to explain it as a fault in the ground, but the fearful looks betrayed another certainty. It wasn't the earth that rejected the priest, it was the sacred itself that expelled him. And it was from that first incident that I understood that this would be no ordinary case of local superstition. It was the beginning of a curse that would, little by little, take hold of all who dared remain nearby. Before continuing this story, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that many prefer to remain silent about. His name was Father Gregory. Hale, and even before his death, his presence had divided the small community. Some saw him as a charismatic man, capable of delivering sermons that captivated even the most skeptical. Others, however, described him as obsessed with occult secrets, a priest who didn't limit himself to traditional scriptures and who delved into readings considered forbidden by the church itself. Rumor had it that he spent entire nights locked in the sacristy, muttering prayers in strange tongues, with black candles lit before symbols hastily scratched into the altar's wood. Over time, these rumors intensified. More conservative believers claimed to hear deep, dissonant chants echoing inside the church when it should have been empty. Some swore that Father Gregory met with a small group of followers in the wee hours of the morning, performing rituals that bore little resemblance to conventional masses. The bolder ones claimed he had renounced the teachings of the faith he once promised to uphold, becoming, in the eyes of many, a heretic. His sudden death only heightened the tension. No one knew for sure what had happened. Some said he suddenly collapsed while praying. Others believed his heart had stopped after yet another of his secret rituals. The truth is, when his passing was announced, the community no longer saw him as a man of God, but as a burden that needed to be buried as soon as possible. His funeral was rushed, almost forced, as if everyone wanted to quickly end any connection with his memory. But the rush to bury him only brought further unease. For instead of erasing the memory of his dark practices, the earth seemed incapable of receiving him, as if even the sacred ground refused his presence. And it was the morning after the first burial that true terror began to spread among us. I was present the night they finally decided to bury Father Gregory. The church was silent, lit only by a few candles flickering before the altar, casting long shadows against the stone walls. The coffin was closed hurriedly, without much respect or farewell. It was as if everyone wanted to forget this man as quickly as possible. We walked to the small cemetery attached to the church, a plot of land that until then had welcomed entire generations without incident. The grave was dug, the body was lowered, and within minutes the earth covered him, closing the chapter of a priest marked by distrust and controversy. That night I returned home, trying to believe it would all end there. But when the sun rose, I received news that would forever change my view of what had truly happened. Some worshippers, arriving early for morning mass, found the tomb open. The coffin, to everyone's astonishment, was outside the grave, resting on the freshly turned earth. There were no signs of tampering, no signs of forced entry, or any animal that might have dug into the ground. It was as if something from within had pushed the box outward with an inexplicable force. The gravediggers swore they had sealed the grave properly, and their expressions left no doubt. They were as terrified as the others. While some tried to find rational justifications, like a fault in the ground or a landslide during the night, others began to whisper that this was proof the priest had not been accepted by the sanctity of the ground itself. Panic wasn't declared publicly, but it was in the air. There was something deeply wrong with that scene, and we all knew it was just the beginning. And indeed, it didn't take long for new attempts to end that story to turn into even greater terror. After the scandal that morning, the community decided to act quickly. They reopened the grave, replaced the coffin, and this time reinforced the grave with large stones and extra layers of earth, believing the weight would prevent any movement. Some men stood guard through the night, armed with flashlights and forced courage, as if they could watch over death itself. But to no avail. When the sun rose again, the scene repeated itself. The coffin was once again on the ground, intact, unscratched, resting as if it had never been buried. It was at this point that the murmurs turned to collective fear. The more religious claimed that the sacred earth rejected the priest's body because his practices had been too profane. Others said that he himself in life had sealed a pact that bound him forever to the world of the living. In any case, with each new burial attempt, the result was the same. The coffin returned to the surface as if spat out by the bowels of the earth. On the third night, when they insisted once again on burying him, the cemetery ground began to crack alarmingly. The stones moved on their own, opening crevices that swallowed the newly laid earth. One of the gravediggers swore he saw a tall shadow in a dark cassock walking around the church, chanting low, distorted chants that didn't belong to any known prayer. No one dared to verify, but everyone heard the sound. It was impossible to deny. From then on, no one wanted to approach the church after sunset. Evening masses were suspended, and even the bells, once a symbol of faith and protection, now rang like a funereal omen. The fear no longer spread only among the faithful, but among the clergy themselves, who avoided pronouncing Father Gregory's name aloud. And it was in this climate of despair that the greatest division arose: what to do with the body that neither the earth nor the church seemed to accept. The village was talking about nothing else. Father Gregory's body had become a burden no one wanted to carry, but also a curse that seemed impossible to ignore. Opinions were brutally divided. On one side, those who believed the only solution was to burn the body, purifying it through fire and severing its connection with the earth once and for all. On the other, those who, though frightened, feared that such an act would be even more offensive in the eyes of God, bringing greater condemnation upon us all. Meetings were held in the church itself, but each encounter ended in heated arguments, voices raised in despair, and accusatory looks that reflected growing fear. Some claimed to have seen figures walking between the pews during prayers and swore they heard Gregory's name whispered through the stone walls. The more time passed, the clearer it became that his presence remained among us and that no layer of earth would be able to silence him. They then decided to turn to the local bishop for guidance. But the response was even more disturbing than the problem itself. The bishop refused to intervene, saying it should be seen as a divine trial, a way for God to test the faith of the faithful. Instead of a solution, they received silence and abandonment. In the end, the decision was made not out of courage, but out of exhaustion. They decided to leave the coffin outside the grave, exposed, next to the grave that would never accept it. It was as if everyone had agreed to turn a blind eye, ignoring what they could neither understand nor control. From that day on, the church ceased to be a place of worship and became an avoided territory, cursed by the memory of a priest whom not even death could silence. But, as I've learned over the years, oblivion is never complete, and certain marks remain alive in the silence of the places we dare to abandon. Over time, the old church became a silent monument to fear. Its doors remained closed, and the bells, once proud to announce masses and celebrations, fell into disuse, rusted from neglect. Father Gregory's coffin continued to rest beside the grave that never accepted him, intact, covered only by the dust of years and the weight of stories that multiplied among the residents. No one dared touch it, and even the most skeptical avoided crossing the cemetery's rusty gates after sunset. I myself, having walked those lands so many times, could never forget the feeling of being watched whenever I approached. It was as if invisible eyes followed me, as if muffled voices surrounded me with every step. Some claim that even today, on full moon nights, it is possible to see a figure in a dark cassock walking slowly among the broken pews of the church, head bowed, lips murmuring hymns that do not belong to this world. Others swear that the coffin, though untouched, sometimes shifts position, sliding a few centimeters as if searching in vain for a rest it will never have. The place ended up being avoided by everyone. Families moved away. Children grew up hearing the warning never to play near the hill where the church stands. The ruin remained as a reminder that there are things death cannot erase, and that the sacred is not always enough to contain what defies the order of faith. And if you think this is the most disturbing story a gravedigger can witness, you're wrong. Because not far from there lies another, even more disturbing account, where the sea itself seemed to spit out a body night after night, refusing to leave it on dry land. There are stories that come to us in whispers, as if carried by the wind, stories no one dares to record in books, but that survive because someone told them by a fireside in low tones, afraid of awakening something that might still lurk. I grew up hearing stories about a secluded cemetery built high on a hill in a small American town, a place that seemed perpetually shrouded in mist and where even birds avoided landing. They said a grave there never remained closed, as if the ground itself rejected whoever had been placed beneath it. The elders spoke of toys that would appear on their own during the night. A porcelain doll no one recognized, a weather-beaten wooden car, a rag ball that rolled on its own until it stopped in front of the headstone. No matter how many times the objects were removed, they returned, as if some invisible hand were bringing them back, insisting on playing amid the silence of the tombstones. And most disturbingly, these toys always appeared on the same grave, that of a child who had died too young, leaving the parents plunged into deep mourning. The gravediggers, who were supposed to treat this as routine, began to avoid the site after sunset. Some swore they heard children's laughter piercing the wind, faint and distant, but enough to chill any adult's blood. Others claimed that as they passed the hill, they saw the grave's earth disturbed, as if someone had tried to climb out. When I first heard these accounts, I wanted to believe they were exaggerations, but deep down there was something in the story that couldn't be easily explained. And it was only when I learned who the child buried there was that I realized this mystery was far from being a simple small-town legend. Before continuing this story, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that many prefer to remain silent about. Her name was Sarah Miller, and even today it's impossible to talk about her death without a heavy silence. Descending upon every conversation, Sarah was only 7 years old when she suddenly fell ill, suffering from a fever that no local doctor could control. Her parents, Rebecca and Jonathan, were well known in the community, simple people who lived in a wooden house on the side of the main road. For days, they watched their daughter's life slowly fade, helpless. Every dawn, her muffled screams and desperate prayers echoed off the walls of the house, and the entire neighborhood knew something terrible was about to happen. When the disease finally prevailed, the entire town seemed plunged into collective mourning. It wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the feeling that something innocent and pure had been unfairly taken away. The funeral was marked by haste and tears. The small coffin, adorned with white flowers, seemed like a fragile box incapable of bearing the weight of such a farewell. The procession slowly ascended the hill, accompanied by looks of compassion, but also by an uneasy feeling that no one dared to admit aloud. Sarah's parents wept inconsolably. Her mother had to be held to keep from fainting as the coffin was lowered into the grave. And her father, his eyes red, kept repeating that she shouldn't be there, that this wasn't her home, that Sarah needed to return to them. Words spoken in the heat of grief perhaps, but which echoed among all present like an omen. As the earth covered the coffin, a cold current ran down the hill, causing many to shiver. Immediately, no one could explain it, but it seemed as if the place somehow rejected such a small body. I myself felt as if the atmosphere around it had changed, as if an invisible energy had settled in the cemetery. And it was from that night onwards that the first signs began to appear, signs that would make it clear that Sarah had not accepted resting far from home. The morning after the burial, the gravediggers were the first to notice something strange. Lying on the freshly turned earth was an antique porcelain doll, the kind with glass eyes that seemed to follow whoever looks at it. None of the family had left any toys at the grave, and everyone swore nothing had been there the night before. Some tried to believe it was just a coincidence, that someone might have placed it there out of compassion, but no one came forward to acknowledge the gesture. In the days that followed, new toys appeared. A weather-beaten wooden car mysteriously appeared on top of the headstone. Then a ball of cloth covered in dirt rolled alone down the hillside until it came to rest before Sarah's grave. With each new object, the certainty grew that something inexplicable was happening. What disturbed everyone most was that the toys didn't belong to the girl's family. They were antiques, seemingly forgotten for decades, and now returned from somewhere unseen. One night, one of the gravediggers making his rounds swore he heard children's laughter coming from the top of the hill. He described the sound as soft, even cheerful, but completely out of place amid the silence of the cemetery. Moved by courage, or perhaps foolishness, he climbed to the grave and found the earth disturbed again. The tomb seemed to have been stirred from the inside out, as if something were trying to escape. The coffin remained in place but partially exposed, as if the earth refused to hold it. When I visited the cemetery a few days later, I felt as if I were being watched. The wind blew through the trees, but there was something else, something more than just imagination. A light, almost childlike presence seemed to follow my steps. It was at that moment that I realized this wasn't a story about silent death, but about something that refused to accept its end. And when the city's residents began reporting what they saw during the early hours of the morning, the story stopped being just a mystery and became a fear shared by everyone. It wasn't long before the signs were no longer just a secret among gravediggers and spread throughout the village. Soon, residents began swearing they saw a small figure walking along the road leading to the cemetery in the early hours of the morning. She was described as a child with disheveled hair, bare feet, and wearing the same white dress Sarah wore on the day of the funeral. She always walked slowly, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if searching for something she couldn't find. Some claimed that when they tried to approach, the figure simply vanished into thin air, leaving only an intense chill that turned their breath to mist, even on the warmest nights. The local dogs also seemed to react to the inexplicable. Suddenly, they began barking furiously whenever they passed near the cemetery, growling into space, their fur standing on end, as if seeing something human eyes couldn't. Parents began forbidding children from playing near the hill, and even the youngest, who had previously laughed at the superstitions, began avoiding the path that cut through the cemetery at nightfall. The most disturbing episode occurred on a Sunday morning. Sarah's coffin, which had been carefully covered with additional layers of earth, was once again uncovered. It was intact, but surrounded by small, bare footprints imprinted in the mud, as if a child had walked around it several times before disappearing toward the road. The parents were called quickly, and the mother, upon seeing the marks, fell to her knees in tears, begging them to return her daughter home. It was from that moment on that the entire city understood that it was no longer a coincidence or collective imagination. Something or someone refused to remain in that tomb. And it was then that the family, desperate and without answers, decided to try something different in the hope of finally calming the spirit of their daughter, who seemed unwilling to accept eternal rest. The Millers could no longer bear living with the feeling that their daughter was calling to them night after night. With each mysterious toy that appeared, each time the grave was opened, their despair deepened. Rebecca, her mother, began visiting the grave daily, bringing her daughter's dolls, as if Sarah's spirit needed them to not feel alone. Jonathan wrote little letters, folded them carefully, and left them beside the headstone, begging for his daughter to find peace. It was their way of trying to transform their pain into solace, believing that somehow she could receive what she loved so much in life. The community, simultaneously moved and frightened, began organizing nightly vigils at the cemetery. Local pastors were called to pray over the grave. They surrounded the tomb with salt, recited biblical passages aloud, asked God to welcome her, and sealed the coffin with crucifixes. There was a moment that night when everyone believed the torment was over. The wind died down, the silence felt welcoming, and for the first time since the burial, the hill exuded a sense of calm. For a few hours, hearts filled with hope. Many began to believe that the prayers had finally soothed the child's spirit. But the illusion was short-lived. The next morning, the toys were once again scattered over the grave, covered in dew, as if left there by unseen hands. The coffin was partially exposed, the earth disturbed around it, and once again, small, bare footprints marked the fresh mud, leading toward the road that led back to the village. It was at that moment that we understood. That no prayer, no object left in the coffin would be enough to stop Sarah from continuing to search for what she wanted most. And to this day, many believe that she still wanders the nights, searching for the only place her spirit always wanted to be, her own home. The cemetery on the hill was never the same after Sarah Miller's burial. Today, it remains abandoned, with crooked crosses, moss-covered headstones, and a dense atmosphere that seems to repel any visitor. The few who still dare to pass by always report the same thing. Toys mysteriously appear in front of the grave, even when no one is around. A wooden horse sways on its own in the wind, a rag ball rolls to a stop in front of the grave, and antique dolls are found sitting on the ground as if someone had carefully placed them there. The most disturbing thing, however, is not the objects themselves, but the sounds. Many report hearing light footsteps on the gravel of the cemetery, accompanied by children's laughter that fades as someone approaches. Some swear they've seen a small figure walking slowly down the road toward town, always barefoot, always looking at the horizon, as if searching for a way back home. The accounts describe the same detail. The child never looks directly at the observer, but their presence is so real it chills the blood. Over time, the village learned to avoid the hill. Parents warn their children, travelers change their route, and even the most skeptical fall silent upon hearing. Sarah's name, what no one dares deny, is the feeling that this spirit is still trapped between two worlds, unable to detach itself from the life that was ripped from it too soon. And if you think this is the only story in which death refuses to accept peace, you're mistaken. Because not far from there is another, even more disturbing story, that of a priest whose coffin never remained in his grave, as if even the sacred ground had rejected his presence. There are places that seem to carry within them an indelible weight, places where death didn't bring silence, but rather a restlessness that persists even after centuries. One such place is an old slave cemetery located in a small town in the southern United States. From the moment I first heard about it, I realized it wasn't a legend told to frighten travelers, but something much deeper, almost like an open scar that insists on bleeding even after so long. They said that every attempt to disturb the soil brought disturbing consequences. Gravediggers reported that when they began removing the bones to transfer them to another location, chains could be heard dragging throughout the night, as if the iron shackles that had once imprisoned those people continued to echo in the darkness. Graves, which should have remained closed, were dismantled in the morning, fragile coffins turned over on their own, and the sensation was that someone or something was resisting being moved with all its might. I was there myself on one of those nights. The wind seemed to carry voices, laments that mingled with the low, continuous metallic sound of chains scraping against the earth. No logical explanation could hold water for long, because every man who tried to work on that land abandoned the job before the second dawn. It was impossible to ignore the invisible weight hanging over that place. And if at first it seemed like just a coincidence or a figment of the workers' imagination, truth is that it was enough to know the story behind those graves, to understand that the fear came not only from the living, but also from those who never accepted forced rest. Before continuing this story, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss the next stories that many prefer to remain silent about. To understand what happened there, we must go back long before the first attempts to remove the bones. The cemetery was created in the late 18th century, at a time when enslaved men, women, and children had no right to dignified graves or to have their names engraved in stone. Many were buried in mass graves, while others received only wooden crosses that deteriorated over time until they disappeared completely. It was a patch of land where pain accumulated, where every inch held stories of suffering never told aloud. For years, the neighboring community maintained a silent respect for the site. There were no flowers, no ceremonies, only a somber acknowledgement. The bodies lay buried there, who would never be fully laid to rest. Some families said they preferred to change their route to avoid passing the rusty gate, and some even avoided looking toward the hill where the cemetery rested. It was as if everyone knew the pain imbued in that land could not be disturbed. But time, as always, brought oblivion. Decades later, as the city grew, urban projects emerged that threatened to occupy that space. The decision was made in quick meetings to move the bones to another location, reorganize the graves, and make way for new construction. For the authorities, it was merely a practical, bureaucratic matter with no sentimental value. However, for the workers tasked with moving that soil, each day of excavation became a plunge into something heavier than they could bear. It was at this moment that the first signs began to appear, as if the dead wanted to make it clear that they would not accept being moved again after a lifetime of forced displacement. And it was during the first excavation work that the gravediggers heard for the first time the unmistakable sound of chains dragging under the earth. I remember the first day work began. Shovels pounded against the hardened earth, and soon the fragile coffins, worn by time, began to appear. Many of them crumbled at the mere touch, revealing bones that exuded an uneasy silence. There was no crying, no human lament, but the atmosphere was so heavy that even the most experienced gravediggers avoided speaking loudly, as if each word might awaken something that had lain there for centuries. That night, just when everyone thought the worst was over, the noises began. One of the men on guard swore he heard the metallic sound of chains dragging in the darkness. At first they tried to laugh it off, saying it was just the wind or some animal loose in the trees. But the next morning, the graves that had been dug were mysteriously disturbed. The earth seemed to have been disturbed from within, and in some places the coffins were overturned, as if someone had pushed them violently. Each workday turned into psychological torture. The men dug during the day, but at dawn they found everything in a worse state than they had left it. Some reported muffled groans coming from the earth. Others said they felt vibrations in the ground, as if heavy footsteps were dragging beneath them. I myself, when I was there, had the distinct feeling that we were not alone. The air seemed to vibrate, charged with an energy that could not be explained by logic. Some said the chains we heard weren't metaphors, but the shackles that once bound those bodies, echoing as a warning that the dead would not accept being violated again. And the more the gravediggers persisted, the more clear and disturbing the signs became. Until, on a moonless night, the first shadows were seen walking among the tombstones, transforming fear into absolute despair. That night, the silence was broken by something none of us would ever forget. The sky was dark, moonless, and the wind seemed to have suddenly ceased, as if even nature itself was afraid to cross that place. I was sitting near the iron gate, trying to convince myself it was all just my imagination, when I heard slow footsteps echoing among the graves. They weren't light, like an animal's, but heavy, dragging, as if someone were carrying chains attached to their feet. When I looked up, I saw a tall silhouette walking among the tombstones. It was blurry, seemingly formed of shadows denser than the darkness itself, and with each step the chains clinked, dragging across the earth with a metallic sound that chilled my spine. I tried to call out to one of the men with me, but my voice faltered. Even so, I could tell by his gaze that he, too, saw the same figure. It wasn't some individual delusion. It was real, even if it wasn't of this world. The shadow walked slowly, as if following a path already traveled 1,000. At times. At times it seemed to lean over the newly dug graves, and the echoing sound was like a long, deep sigh, like the lament of someone who has never found rest. Some gravediggers, overcome by panic, dropped their tools and fled without looking back. Others remained motionless, gripped by fear, as if the mere thought of moving would draw that presence closer. That morning, no one dared continue the work. When the sun rose, we again found open graves, overturned coffins, and drag marks on the ground, as if something heavy had been pulled from one side to the other. It was impossible to deny. There was a presence there, an invisible force that would not allow the rest of the dead to be disturbed. And it was then that the situation surpassed the limits of bearable fear, forcing the community to make a drastic decision about the fate of that cemetery. After that night, when shadows walked among the tombstones, no one could approach the job the same way again. The news spread quickly through the village, and what had previously been a murmur among gravediggers turned into a collective panic. Families avoided leaving their homes after sunset, and even the most skeptical began to admit that something was wrong here. Fear spread like a silent disease, gnawing at every conversation, every suspicious glance, every prayer whispered in the darkness. Local authorities, pressured by the urban project that needed to move forward, decided to call religious leaders to bless the cemetery. Priests, pastors, and even traveling preachers were summoned to pray over the open graves. For a few moments, it seemed as if the weight was lifting, but nightfall was enough for everything to return with even greater intensity. The chains clanged louder, the moans became clearer, and the graves emerged once again unmade. It was as if every attempt at intervention was violently rejected. The gravediggers, exhausted and traumatized, began to abandon their work altogether. Many refused, even to travel along the road that led to the cemetery. Some claimed to have been plagued by constant nightmares, dreams in which invisible hands were pulling them into the earth. Others swore they had woken in the middle of the night, hearing the sound of chains inside their own homes. With each new report, the community sank deeper into terror, convinced that the curse was not confined to the cemetery, but had spread along with those who dared disturb the soil. With no alternatives and fearing something worse would happen, the authorities decided to shut down the project. The bones were left where they were, the graves abandoned without being properly closed, and the cemetery was sealed with rusty chains on its gates. Officially, they said it was a budgetary delay, but we all knew the truth. There was no force capable of forcing those dead to rest elsewhere, and that's how the old cemetery remained untouched, keeping a secret that lives on to this day in the metallic sound that echoes on the quietest nights. The cemetery remains to this day like an open scar on the city, a space officially forgotten, but never ignored by the collective memory. The rusty gates were locked decades ago, but everyone knows it's not the iron that prevents entry, but the fear that has taken hold of each resident. The surrounding trees seem to grow crookedly, leaning away from the land, as if even nature itself wants to avoid that soil marked by suffering. And when night falls, the stories continue. The sound of chains echoing in the darkness, shuffling footsteps prowling the place, and figures moving among the tombstones like invisible guardians of a rest that was never attained. Some travelers unfamiliar with the story swear they've stopped before the gate and felt an intense chill run down their spines, as if invisible hands were pushing them back, forcing them to retreat. Others claim that on moonless nights, muffled moans can be heard coming from beneath the earth, moans that blend with the breath of the wind, but which carry a pain that no amount of time has been able to erase. No one dares cross the gates after sunset, for everyone knows that, within, the chains have never been silenced. The former slave cemetery has become more than a forgotten space. It has become a warning, a somber reminder that death is not always synonymous with silence. and that certain wounds, when touched, bleed again. Some say the spirits still await justice, refusing to be displaced once more, as if the soil itself bore witness to a past that refuses to be buried. If you believe some stories deserve to be remembered, subscribe to the channel now and follow the next reports. There are even more disturbing secrets waiting to be revealed, and only those who stick around until the end can face what's to come.